In the newspapers, you may have read recently when Minister Mentor was talking about how the pledge came about. That is how the pledge came to be written. The pledge was written by Mr. S. Rajah, one of the founding members of the People's Action Party, a journalist. He was educated in the UK, and we regard him as one of our founding fathers. And what's very special is the fact that in Singapore, we don't see Mr. Rajaratnam as anything other than Singaporean. He's actually the architect of the pledge, which has become the basis of our aspiration. And basically what the pledge says is that we, the citizens of Singapore, pledge ourselves to be a united people, regardless of race, language, or religion. And that's a very powerful thing, because you have to remember how fractured society was at that time. We didn't have a Singapore identity. Overnight, you had a small country that suddenly found itself alone with virtually no money in the government coffers, no army defense to speak of, a very weak economy, a population that was largely illiterate. Not everybody was living in proper housing, and basically our future looked very bleak. But the first thing we did was to say that we have to do this as a team. That's why the pledge, because the pledge makes every Singaporean think and feel that no matter what your background is, no matter your race, your language, or religion, we're one people, and we pledge ourselves to build this country irrespective of whatever background we come from. So that was the beginnings, the desire to be an independent and a sovereign nation, and then you had the challenge of how to build a people that came from so many different backgrounds. First thing we did was to make the three languages official: Chinese, meaning Mandarin, Tamil, because Singapore had more Tamils than the other Indians, and Malay as the official languages. Malay was the national language, but the government realized that if you wanted to develop, if you wanted to advance, you have to speak in the language that actually the world economy speaks in, and that of course was English, because UK was still very much a leading international power at that time, and the US was only just on the rise. So English became our language of commerce, but it served another purpose. It also became the common language, because in India, as you know, you have so many different regions, you have so many different dialects. You may not be able to speak, the same dialect to everyone, but I have found when I visited there, almost everyone speaks English. The same is true of Singapore. It may be difficult for someone who was brought up speaking Tamil or Hindi to be able to communicate with someone in Mandarin and vice versa, but almost everybody knows a little bit of English. So English became the language that bonded us, but we also recognized that people must not forget their roots, because other countries have made the mistake of trying to stamp out somebody's cultural and racial and ethnic identity. And we realized that you can't do that, because the Chinese were proud to be Chinese, the Indians were proud to be Indians, and within the Indians, the Tamils had their own particular subgroup. There was the Punjabis have their own, the Malayalis have their own, and so on and so forth, and the Malays have their own culture as well. So eventually we came about with a policy where you speak English, but everyone learns their mother tongue. This is to preserve your racial identity, to know your roots, to know who you are, where you come from, but to also understand that you are one with the other people who share this country. It became a big thing at that time to ensure that we bonded the races, because when you go out today, you see Singapore so quiet and so peaceful. Many of you can take the bus home, the public bus, no problem. You can even take a taxi back, no issue. But Singapore was not always like that. In the early days, after we achieved independence, Singapore was a very fragile state, and the risk of having racial riots was very strong. This was illustrated by the Maria Hertog riots. Let me tell you the story of Maria Hertog. Dutch girl. She was left here during the war and brought up by an Indonesian family. So she was basically given a Muslim name, and she was brought up in the Muslim tradition. After the war, her parents came back, and they wanted to take her back. But of course, by that time, the family who had taken her in didn't want to give her up, and there was a tussle between her biological family and her adoptive family. The case was brought to the courts. The courts ruled in favor of the biological family. She was allowed to be taken home. But it caused such a deep reaction amongst people because they felt that she was being taken away to a different culture. She was being taken away from the religion that she had been brought up in and from the family that had brought her up for several years. And so what happened was that there was widespread riots that broke out all over Singapore. There were a few people that were killed. There was a lot of fighting. I remember that period because my father was a policeman. He had to go out and basically help to keep the peace. So Singapore was not always as peaceful as you see today. And it's things like that that made us have a very deep desire and commitment to ensure that in Singapore we will have peace, we will have a harmonious relationship between the different races. But then the question is how to do that. It's very easy to say, I want to do it. How do you do it? Well, language is one of the things, as I mentioned earlier. The second thing was housing. Everywhere you go, you see HDB estates. That's public housing. But we realized that if you make all the Malays live together, as the British did, because any country that has been under colonial rule will know this, the British were very good colonial masters in terms of their administration. One of the things that they did was basically to leave local culture alone. They would leave you in your different groups because their sense of it was that they would provide the overall administration, but when it came to local ethnic cultural things, they would let the local groups take care of it. That's okay if you're a colony, but that's not okay if you're a nation or a sovereign country because you're trying to build people together. And one of the things that we realized was that at that time, many of the Malays lived in Geylang area, many of the Indians in Little India, the Chinese in Chinatown, and that was just segregating people. So the next step that had to be done was to integrate people in terms of their housing. And so now we have a housing policy that for every HDB block, there is a certain quota that is reserved for the ethnic minorities. And when they sell, they have to sell to another minority, or else it has to be adjusted in such a way that the quota is always preserved. So that there are two things here. One, it allows people to be integrated. Two, you don't have a situation where only the better off live in the rich area and the poor live in another area. So every race has the ability to have access to a better area. For example, it was a HDB policy that we must be able to have flats even by the seaside. In any other country, flats by the sea are actually a premium. But we didn't want it to be that only rich people can live by the sea. It must be the case that even those who have public housing and cannot afford private housing must have access to live by the seaside just like the richer ones. And in those blocks, which are at Marine Parade, you have the ethnic quota so that everybody has a sense that they too have a fair shot. So housing was